Right now, every major government on Earth is doing something they will never openly admit. They're competing, quietly, strategically, sometimes desperately. Not over territory, not over armies, over the value of their currency. And the strange part? Most of the weapons in this war are invisible. They're decisions made in committee rooms, interest rate announcements, bond purchases, carefully worded central bank statements, tools so mundane they put financial journalists to sleep. But the consequences are anything but mundane. They determine whether your salary stretches further or snaps, whether your country's exports survive or collapse, whether a developing nation drowns in debt or climbs out of it, whether the dollar stays king or slowly loses its throne. This is the currency war. It's been running for decades, and most people have no idea it exists. What a currency war actually is. Here's a question that sounds basic but goes surprisingly deep. Why would a government want its own currency to be weaker? Your instinct probably says a strong currency is good. And in some ways, you're right. A strong currency makes imports cheaper. It gives citizens more purchasing power on the global market. It sounds like winning. But governments, specifically their central banks and finance ministries, often think differently. Because here's the uncomfortable arithmetic of global trade. When your currency weakens, your exports get cheaper for foreign buyers. A Japanese car that costs $1,000,000 to produce suddenly looks far more attractive to an American buyer when the yen is weak. A weaker currency is essentially a hidden subsidy for your entire export sector. No legislation required, no trade deal needed, just a quieter exchange rate and your factories suddenly look competitive again. That's the core logic. And it sounds almost harmless until you realize that every country doing this simultaneously creates a feedback loop with no obvious exit. One country weakens its currency to gain an edge. Its trading partners feel the squeeze. They weaken theirs. Then comes retaliation. Then escalation. Then you're in a currency war where every nation is racing to the bottom hoping to get there first without looking like they're racing at all. The economist James Rickards coined the phrase currency wars in his 2011 book. But the phenomenon is far older and far more active than most people realize. The history they don't teach in school. The most famous currency war in modern history didn't happen in some obscure corner of the financial world. It unfolded at the center of the global economy, in the 1930s, during the Great Depression. By 1931, countries were desperate, unemployment was catastrophic, factories were idle. Governments were under enormous political pressure to do something. The problem was that most economies were locked to the gold standard, a system where each unit of currency could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. It sounded stable. In practice, it was a straitjacket. So, one by one, countries started breaking free. Britain left the gold standard in 1931. The US followed in 1933. Others joined the exit later. And as each country left, they could suddenly devalue their currency, making their exports cheaper, stimulating domestic industry, trying to claw back economic activity from their neighbors. Economists later called this beggar thy neighbor policy. Grow yourself by shrinking someone else. The problem, as you might imagine, is that when every neighbor is beggaring every other neighbor simultaneously, the whole system just shrinks. Global trade collapsed. Protectionism surged. The depression deepened. It took a world war to finally shock the global economy back to life. After World War II, the architects of the new economic order tried to prevent this from happening again. The Bretton Woods system tied global currencies to the US dollar and the dollar to gold. It created a kind of enforced truce in currency competition. For about 2 decades, it held. Then in 1971, President Nixon did something that changed the global financial system permanently. He ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. Overnight, The world entered an era of floating exchange rates currencies, whose values were now determined by markets, capital flows, and increasingly, by the deliberate policy choices of governments and central banks. The currency war truce was over. The arena just got much bigger. The modern war and its invisible weapons. Fast forward to the early 2000s. China had become the factory floor of the world. Goods flowed west in extraordinary volumes. American consumers were buying more and more of everything, much of it made in China. And China's currency, the yuan, was, by most estimates, significantly undervalued. The U.S. Treasury put it diplomatically. Economists were less polite. China was accused of deliberately suppressing the yuan's value to keep Chinese exports artificially competitive. The mechanism wasn't complicated. China's central bank bought massive quantities of US dollars, flooding the market with yuan, keeping its value suppressed relative to the dollar. The result was a structural advantage that lasted for years. American manufacturers found it nearly impossible to compete on price. Jobs moved, factories closed, and the US ran enormous trade deficits with China, year after year, while Chinese foreign reserves swelled into the trillions. China always denied it was manipulation. It called its policy managed exchange rates, as if the distinction somehow changed what was happening. But here's where it gets genuinely complicated. The US wasn't exactly innocent either. After the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve launched an unprecedented program called quantitative easing, essentially creating enormous amounts of new money and using it to buy bonds. The stated goal was to stimulate the U.S. economy by lowering long-term interest rates. The side effect, which economists flagged immediately, was a weaker dollar. More dollars in circulation, lower interest rates attracting less foreign investment, capital flowing to higher-yielding markets elsewhere. Brazil's finance minister at the time, Guido Mantega, was blunt. He declared in 2010 that an international currency war had broken out. He wasn't being theatrical. He was describing what he saw happening to his country. When the US flooded the system with cheap dollars, that money didn't stay in the US. It flowed toward higher returns into emerging markets, into Brazil, into Indonesia, into South Africa. That surge of foreign capital pushed up those countries' currencies, making their exports suddenly expensive, slowing their economies, creating inflation pressures they hadn't asked for and couldn't easily control. The weapon the US used was a domestic policy tool. The casualties were abroad, and nobody officially declared anything. The dollar's uncomfortable privilege. Here's the thing that makes currency wars uniquely strange. They aren't fought on level ground. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency. Roughly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. Oil is priced in dollars. International debt contracts are often written in dollars. When countries around the world trade with each other, many of them convert through dollars as an intermediate step, even if neither country is American. This gives the United States what the French economist Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously called an exorbitant privilege. The U.S. can run persistent trade deficits, importing more than it exports without facing the crisis that would normally accompany such an imbalance. Because the world needs dollars to function, other countries must earn dollars through exports or borrow them. The U.S. simply prints them. This privilege creates a paradox at the heart of every currency conflict involving the U.S. When the Federal Reserve eases monetary policy to help the American economy, it also exports financial conditions to every country holding dollar reserves or carrying dollar-denominated debt. A weaker dollar might stimulate U.S. exports, but it simultaneously increases the real burden of dollar-denominated debt for developing nations, triggers capital flight, and forces foreign central banks to react, often by cutting their own rates in response, even if their domestic conditions don't warrant it. In other words, the U.S. doesn't have to intend to wage currency war. Its size alone, means every major policy decision ripples through the global system, whether it wants it to or not. Other countries know this. Some resent it deeply, and some are actively working to change it. The challengers. For at least a decade, a quiet conversation has been building among nations that would prefer a world less dependent on the US dollar. The word used is de-dollarization, and while it has often been dismissed as wishful thinking from geopolitical adversaries, something has shifted in recent years. Russia's exclusion from the SWIFT financial messaging system following its invasion of Ukraine in 2022 accelerated this conversation sharply. Suddenly, the message to every country that might one day find itself in Washington's crosshairs was unmistakable. Dollar dependency is a vulnerability. If the US can freeze a country out of the global financial system, then any nation holding large dollar reserves or dependent on dollar-denominated trade is, in a meaningful sense, exposed. China has been the most systematic in its response. The yuan's international usage has been steadily growing. China has negotiated bilateral currency swap agreements with dozens of countries' arrangements that allow trade to be settled in yuan and local currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS grouping of major emerging economies, has discussed the creation of a new reserve currency or payment system to reduce collective dollar dependence. None of this has toppled the dollar, not even close. The network effects of dollar dominance are enormous. Decades of infrastructure, legal frameworks, and institutional habit don't unwind quickly. But the direction of travel is notable. The share of global reserves held in dollars has declined from roughly 72% in 2000 to around 58% today. That's a slow drift. But in geopolitical terms, slow drifts become tipping points. And in the background, central banks are quietly doing something that tells its own story. Since 2010, central banks around the world have been net buyers of gold, adding to reserves at a pace not seen since the end of the Bretton Woods era. When the institutions responsible for managing national currencies start accumulating an asset that exists outside the dollar system, it's reasonable to ask what they know that they aren't saying publicly, what this actually means for ordinary people. Currency wars feel abstract until they don't. The mechanisms are technical. The policy decisions happen in rooms most people never enter. But the consequences land on everyone. Inflation is the most direct channel. When a government deliberately weakens its currency, imports become more expensive. If your economy is heavily import-dependent, which most modern economies are, that cost passes through the supply chain and shows up on price tags. The citizen who buys groceries is absorbing the cost of a decision made by a central banker trying to stimulate export growth. Interest rates are another. In a world of interconnected capital flows, central banks often can't set rates based purely on domestic conditions. They have to watch what the Fed does, what the ECB does, because capital will flow to wherever returns are highest, and that flow moves exchange rates, which affects inflation, which affects growth. A small, open economy raising rates to fight inflation might attract so much foreign capital that its currency appreciates, hurting its exporters, creating a new problem to solve. Monetary policy in a world of currency competition is like trying to control your own temperature while sharing a room with someone who keeps adjusting the thermostat. And for developing nations, the stakes are often existential rather than merely uncomfortable. Countries that borrowed heavily in US dollars during periods of low rates find themselves acutely exposed when the dollar strengthens. Their debt, measured in their own currency, suddenly grows. Their central banks are forced to raise rates to defend their exchange rate, even if their economy is contracting. This dynamic has pushed countries into crisis before Argentina, Turkey, Sri Lanka, and it will again. The currency war isn't just a game between superpowers with deep reserves. It has a long tail that reaches into the savings, the jobs, and the basic economic stability of hundreds of millions. The question nobody has answered. Here's what makes the currency war genuinely hard to resolve. There is no referee. The International Monetary Fund exists partly to monitor exchange rate manipulation and promote global monetary stability. In practice, its ability to compel behavioral change among major economies is close to zero. The US, China, Japan, and the Eurozone operate essentially outside any meaningful constraint. They set their own monetary policy. They manage their own exchange rates to the extent they choose to, and they absorb whatever criticism follows with studied calm. The World Trade Organization can adjudicate disputes about tariffs and trade rules. Currency manipulation sits in an ambiguous zone, widely practiced, rarely admitted, almost never formally penalized. What keeps the system from spiraling into total chaos is, paradoxically, mutual interest. Major economies are so deeply integrated through trade, through capital markets, through supply chains, that a genuinely destructive currency war would hurt everyone, including its architects. The 1930s showed what full-scale competitive devaluation looks like. Nobody wants to revisit that. But nobody wants catastrophe as a fragile foundation for a system governing the financial lives of 8 billion people. And as geopolitical tensions rise, as economic nationalism accelerates, as the post-Cold War consensus around free trade and open capital markets frays at the edges, that foundation looks more fragile than it did 10 years ago. The currency war continues. It's running right now, in the gap between what central banks say their policies are for and what those policies actually do to the rest of the world. It's running in the negotiations between countries deciding whether to settle their trade in dollars or something else. It's running in the decision of a central bank governor who quietly authorizes the purchase of another 10 tons of gold. Most of it never makes the headlines. Most of it will never be officially acknowledged. But it shapes the world you live in, more consistently and more profoundly than almost any other force in modern economics. The only real question is whether the current uneasy equilibrium holds, or whether something finally tips it. History suggests these things tip eventually. It just never announces exactly when.